Welcome and thank you for joining NOMAD today for part 2 of Let's Talk About Race, Baby, the collective responsibility on discussing race with our student athletes and coaches, strategies, and implementation. I am Anthony Thomas, NOMAD co-founder, board member, and the director of athletics at Francis Parker School here in San Diego, California. We have an incredible panel here today to help us understand the intentionality and bold leadership required to transform our communities into one steeped in understanding and empathy. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to remind everyone what Daryl Wing Su writes in his book, Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence. That honest race talk is one of the most powerful means to dispel stereotypes and biases, to increase racial literacy and critical consciousness about race issues, to decrease fear of differences, to broaden one's horizons, to increase compassion and empathy, to increase appreciation of all colors and cultures, and to enhance a greater sense of belonging and connectedness. So that is our mission, that is our goal. And we have 4 great panelists who will help us through this today. Now, just a couple of housekeeping measures. Please keep yourselves muted. We will have opportunities at the end to ask questions and engage in dialogue. We will let the panelists speak. If you have a question for the panelists, please write it in the chat, and we will answer that question right when the panelist has completed their talk, or you can wait till the end and we will have a complete dialogue with all 4. So again, thank you for being here today. Now let's meet our panelists. First, Scott N. Brooks is Associate Professor with the T. Denny Sanford School of Social and Family Dynamics, an academic unit of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Arizona State University. In his role as Associate Director of the Global Sports Institute at ASU, Brooks acts as a campus liaison and assists in the allocation of internal and external research grants, in addition to coordinating the Institute's research agenda and projects. As a scholar, Brooks is primarily interested in youth and sport, inequality in sport, coaching and leadership, and community-based sports interventions. He has published in academic journals, edited volumes and textbooks, been quoted and reviewed by the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Der Spiegel, and Slam magazine, and has been invited to speak on the topic of sports internationally. His book, Black Men Can't Shoot, tells the importance of exposure, networks, and opportunities towards earning an athletic scholarship and high school coaches and athletes. Additionally, Brooks has consulted the NFL, the MLB, and college, and is a senior fellow at the Wharton Sports Business Initiative and the Yale Urban Ethnography Project. Dr. Brooks, thank you for being here. We also have Dr. Renae Myles Payne, who has been at the University of Miami since October 2019. She was hired as a Senior Associate Athletic Director for Administration and designated the Chief Diversity Officer. Her athletic administration career spans 22 years with stops at the University of Connecticut, the University of Pittsburgh, San Jose State University, Delaware State University, Southwest Baptist University, Alabama A&M University, and Winthrop University. She is a graduate of the University of Southern Mississippi, where she participated in track and field. She received her master's degree from Northwestern State University in Louisiana and her doctoral degree from the University of Pittsburgh. She is on the executive board of MOA, the Minority Opportunities Athletic Association, and has served on several university, conference, and NC2A committees. In 2019, Renae was honored by Women's Leaders in College Sports as the Administrator of the Year in Division I. She is a member of Sigma Gamma Rho sorority, I see you Greek, as well as several civic and professional organizations and associations. Welcome, Dr. Renae. Next, we have Mautrice Meriweather. Mautrice has been with the National Federation of State High Schools Associations for 20 years and is currently the organization's Chief Talent Officer. In this role, she is responsible for leading the human capacity efforts of the NFHS, ensuring that the national office is attracting and retaining high quality talent while also creating opportunities for growth and professional development within the national office and state association offices within the NFHS membership. Mautrice is certified HR professional and is currently leading the internal diversity, equity, and inclusion team at the NFHS. She holds a bachelor's in English and master's in applied communications with a focus on corporate communication, both from Indiana University, Indianapolis. And last, we have Dr. Keith Stanley Brooks. Keith is a native of Los Angeles, California. Above all else, he views himself as striving to be a great husband, father, mentor, and servant leader. Brooks is a proud alum of Xavier University of Louisiana, where he had a BA in English education. It's also where he completed a Master's of Education degree in teaching leadership and a doctorate in work in human resource education at the University of Minnesota, Twin City. Professionally, he has implemented extensive equity work as an administrator with numerous school districts, community organizations, and government agencies through a youth and adult development support focus. In addition, Dr. Brooks has been a pre-K through 12th grade district administrator. In higher education, Dr. Brooks has been a tenured professor at a university and a dean of academic foundations at a community college. Periodically, with Chosen Path Consulting, Brooks also shares his expertise as a facilitator in educational leadership, intercultural competence, goal staff development, and inspirational keynote speakers. Thank you all for being here, and let's get right to it. Dr. Scott Brooks, please begin our conversation.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you, NOMAD directors and executive board. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I want to start by getting at it at the student level, student athlete level. So one of the things that my research is grounded in being with people, is grounded in coaching. So I'm going to start in 2017. 2017 had the opportunity, I think, some of us look forward to, and that was to coach my own son. So I was coaching high school basketball at UC High, University City High in San Diego. I served as an assistant coach. And going into that season, the head coach had asked me, my son had been there for a year. We had moved into the area, and my son was thought to be a special player by the head coach. I had my own questions about that, but the head coach really thought highly of my son. And at the same time, thought that he needed some help handling my son. I'll say it that way. My son was one of two young Black boys on that team. The school is very diverse, but it's right there near the University of California, San Diego, right near borders La Jolla. So it's an affluent area. So while it was diverse, race and ethnic diversity was not so much. There was a lot of international students, but it wasn't necessarily a comfortable place for my son and for other Blacks. So I'm coaching with my son, and I remember talking to him early on about what's the climate, what's the culture like. And we quickly got to the use of the N-word by his teammates. And so he talked about this as being one of the things that he was checking his teammates on, right? Why are they using the N word? And so when I started to speak with coach as we get into practice, I told him, here is Clay's reflection. My son's name is Clay Ali. You can probably figure out how I came up with that name. And so the coach really said, well, I think I've done a pretty good job, right? And here is a middle-aged white guy. I like him a lot. Love him, a really great guy, great coach. And so I said, okay, well, let me see how it goes. And early on, sure enough, first practices, I'm just hearing the N word coming out. So I start checking players. And when the coach sees me, he realizes that he had a blind spot. He thought he had done this. He had checked the players. He didn't realize how much it was going on. So we keep moving. Now, this is 2017. I'm a sociologist. Some of that my son will get through osmosis, right? And I had him read the autobiography of Malcolm X in his sophomore year of high school. So he has a certain amount of social consciousness and awareness. We get into a second or third game, and while I'm standing next to my son as the anthem is being played, he kneels. My immediate response was to lift him up. I was shocked. I didn't know that he was going to do this. My son and I never really talked about it. My intent had been that we would talk about this on the way home. We'd have a thorough conversation. I had been at the University of Missouri in 2015 during the football team's protest. I received personal email death threats with my full name by organizations. And so I was worried about him. It was a natural parental instinct. I didn't know if my son understood what might come with this and whether he was ready for the attention. And so that was my initial reaction. I continue to I'm working through it because I've had numerous conversations with my son in the last year, but this is this many years later. And I had felt some shame about this, right? We never got to have that conversation. My son didn't get to express what he was feeling. And me, particularly as a sociologist who studies social movements, studies social justice, how was I not prepared? And how was it that I didn't figure this thing out for him? Even as a coach, I saw it as a missed opportunity. We didn't get to have the conversation as a team in that moment. And I could have poured into these kids in another way. I knew I didn't have the coach's support. The coach and I did talk briefly. He, when Clay went to kneel, the coaches, I saw him kind of jerk back. And so there was an opportunity for me to work with this coach as well. I'm going to turn quickly to something that I learned that has really sparked me to think of questions for us to think about. In 2016, one of the untold stories is that in the Pac-12 conference, there were women who were soccer players who began kneeling shortly after Colin Kaepernick. One of those women was Havana McAveen, a young Black woman actually from Colorado, playing there under Leslie Galmore, who was a white head coach. But if you go and look at Leslie's file, you'll see how amazing she is as a winner, as a coach, as developing talent. And I've had the opportunity to get to know Havana. And recently, when we talked about her kneeling, she gave me another understanding that I hadn't heard. And she said for her honors thesis as a undergraduate, right, in her senior year, she was looking at all of the violence, police brutality, and Black deaths in 2016 and interviewed young Black men on campus, some that were student athletes and others who were not. And she just wanted to capture how they were feeling. She would go into practice, and after doing these interviews, she said she went to practices and she was inconsolable. She was crying as a captain, leading them through their warm-ups and their stretching because of the weight of just thinking about this. And her coach would tell her, hey, if you need to step out of the, of leading and co-captaining, get yourself together, do that, take your time. But she kept working on that project and she kept going through this season. She found herself needing more breaks. And she said, when a game, she's sitting there lined up for a game, they are standing for the anthem, and the weight of it all put her to her knees. And she said it was in that kneeling that she found healing, that this was not about a protest or demonstration for her. She didn't feel that she didn't know what she would do. She didn't know how to feel better. She dropped to her knees and it began her healing. And so what I want to pose to us when we think about this student athlete level is, what can we do? How can we learn from my missed opportunity? How can we be proactive in this conversation? Asking them, what is going on? What are you feeling? Right? And what are you feeling is different, than asking about what do we need to do. We often, jump to trying to solve their problems, and we don't spend enough time just talking about what they are feeling, what our student athletes are feeling. So I invite us to dig deeper into asking about their feeling. Feeling is data. Feeling is important. Emotions are important to this. And then as we move forward and think about this as a unit and what we're doing, and how we're encouraging our coaches and speaking with our coaches, and then that to the student athletes, you got to go back to your core values, because our core values should help us to understand what directions we should go in. Now, people, and I'm also the director of the School of Social and Family Dynamics, my academic unit, we have as a core value anti-racism. So if that's a core value, that's going to direct decisions we make in terms of hiring. Everything from our staff to our faculty. It's going to help us to direct decisions in terms of equity and inclusion. Are people being paid fairly? Are they being paid equitably? And are we giving second chances and third chances to our students, particularly our students of color and who are minoritized? Then we talk about how we need to support. And I've learned now that, allyship needs to be given to people. People just claim allyship. And that's great that they have the attitude and want to be included. But allyship really has to be a two-way street. It also needs to be given, because you're not just saying the things, you're doing the things. And we have moved to talking about it being an accomplice. That deeper than being an ally. If you think about World War I and World War II, right? Allies have shifted. Think of our allies, the American allies in World War I versus World War II. Think of how different. Think of those shifts. But an accomplice gets their hands dirty. When they get their hands dirty, they can't go back. They are now on that side, right? And so thinking of how we can move to that. And as a team, building a culture that even if we have folks who think and feel differently, we're going to respect where people are and learn to support each other. So I'll leave it with that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. Great words. Appreciate it. Next, we'll go right to Dr. Renae.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Anthony. And wow, Dr. Brooks, you and I it must be osmosis, because we were definitely on the same page. And I'll go, a little bit further and maybe give a little edge to that piece in that allyship and that accomplice piece, because, we call it a co-conspirator here in our space. That came from one of my former student athletes, who's now a professor at the University of Georgia, Bettina Love, who has kind of coined this and brought this together. And so what I'm going to say, and again, it may feel pushback and when I say this, but I don't want you to feel that way. Just hear it out, receive it, and see where it fits in your lifestyle. Allies are needed, but in this moment, we need co-conspirators. Co-conspirators are necessary in this moment. The allies are great. Again, they're needed. You show up, you're present, but you're a noun. We need verbs. We need co-conspirators. We need white people, period. White people to go into the systems and help change them. That's how we move the needle, because we've had allies for a long time in this profession of athletics that I speak of and work in and participate in, and mind you, have chosen to work in this and deal with the mental gymnastics that come along with being a Black woman in this profession trying to move up the ranks. I've chosen to do it. So I love my allies, and you're needed. We need you to send the money to the organizations. We need you to be at the protests. Wonderful. But we need some people that are at the table changing the laws, getting in the systems, making those systems work on our behalf, where there is an equal benefit for everyone. When you're speaking with your student athletes, that is what they're looking for. They're no longer looking for allies. Allies was in Generation X, my generation, and some of you on here too, and some of you that may be baby boomers as well. We were the ally generation. This generation, millennials and Gen Z, they need co-conspirators. And so my challenge to us as Gen Xers and baby boomers is we have to be able to shift into that co-conspirator mindset, turning the protests into the policy, matching the passion of our student athletes with the patience that we have, because we've been through the ringers. We've seen how things have been slow to change and slow to move. They need the patience, but they don't have it. They're ready to move. They're ready to push. They're ready to get things done. And so you need to be able to meet that passion with them, have those tough conversations, be able to speak it in a hip hop, articulation. That's what they hear. We can no longer just give them the old history stories that we had and we learned, because they didn't learn those stories. Remember, we're not teaching history like that in high school as they're coming through. That's no longer the case. So now we need to be able to tell them, okay, I need you to research Fannie Lou Hamer the same way you research Megan the Stallion. You need to be able to tell them how to do that and help them find the information. We are going to set the foundation for them, and we're going to cover them as baby boomers and Gen Xers. But they're going to be the people who are going to change the systems, and they need to be prepared with the information and the education. But you can't educate them in the same ways that we were educated. I'm giving you a real life example of just what has happened in our profession. If you follow college athletics in Illinois State, it's the University of Normal, Illinois, the athletic director there has recently resigned. A couple of weeks ago, he recently resigned. So this summer in June, after the whole George Floyd thing happened, my sorority sister, who's a volleyball player there, she and I had a podcast. And after that podcast, she and I stayed in touch. And she started telling me things that were happening in the department, and there was no action. Everybody was just, oh, okay, George Floyd, passed away. Well, no, he was murdered. Use the correct terminology and help your administrators use the correct terminology. So I started working with her in that. A movement happened when the athletic director got on for the first meeting of the school year in August and went on to say, wonderful, happy you guys are all here, and all Redbird lives matter. The next day, I got a call from her. She said the students are saying they're not playing. Football team decided that they're not going to do anything. Again, Dr. Brooks was at Missouri. It was the same thing. And it was simply happened because you didn't have administrators that were learned in how to talk to this generation of students to get them to turn their protests into policy. So what I worked with them on, behind the scenes to help them turn their anger, their frustration, and their protests into some actionable things that they wanted to see done. So just one thing that they asked for was they wanted a mental health counselor that looked like them. They're not going to talk about their issues with someone who doesn't look like them. So to Dr. Brooks's statement about the white coach who was that, not that he didn't know that it was maybe an issue, he might not have had the actual language. He may not have had the valuable experiences to be able to relate to his son. So I will encourage you, my white brothers and sisters, become a co-conspirator and become a friend to an ally and a person of color who is willing to have the hard conversation with you so we can move this system forward.
Well, I'm going to say if you had a mic, I'd let you drop it. But thank you, Dr. Renae. I always look forward to hearing from you and keeping it positively 100. And thank you for challenging us. I can't wait for the further dialogue that we will have when we've completed the presentations. But next, we will now have Mautrice Meriweather. Mautrice, I'm going to get your slides up here.
Yeah, while you're doing that, thank you for having me. I took a little bit of a different approach, more of an organizational strategy approach. And so I appreciate what has been communicated by Dr. Brooks and Dr. Renae Payne. And so I approach here is really to start at the very top from an organizational strategy standpoint, to start at the very top. And I will tell you that, each year, the NFHS Board of Directors in June, at their June board meeting, they hold a session where they set priorities for the upcoming year. And so this year, our board was very intentional about developing a priority around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, you'll see it here on the screen. But in essence, they really talked about making sure that we put in place some strategies for students, board members, committees, as well as staff members, our staff at the national level. And so this is very important because it does include your student athletes. I put this here because, again, this really represents an acknowledgement of the work needed in this area at the very highest level of leadership, and that's the buy-in portion. So that's very important. Next slide, please. So just really a short month before the development of our board priority, we established a DEI team to really begin some internal discussion around racial inequity as a result and response to the George Floyd murder. We brought a licensed therapist in to facilitate a 90-minute session with our staff. And to talk really about, in large part, the treatment of Blacks in America that really has lived on our pain triangle for hundreds of years. We followed that up with a staff equity survey around work equity experiences, and so starting to have some conversation. So what's very intentional about this slide here is that I wanted to have our staff displayed, the team members, because really each individual selected was intentional, and they represent kind of a certain human condition, if you will. For example, we have someone on there who's a white male married to a Black female. We have a white female here who has a brown son. We have someone from the LGBTQ community, and so forth and so on. So there's some representation and perspective there. So I wanted to bring that up. Next slide, please, and I'll move through this pretty quickly because I want to get to some strategies here. So after we worked with our staff, really worked an appetite up for more discussion, we thought it would really be important to bring some structure to our work and develop a plan. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is kind of the organizational strategy behind facilitating conversations. So suggesting that there's a strategy that has to be in place, and not to move away from any of those organic conversations that need to happen, but to at least have a strategy and a plan in place. And as you can see here, we kind of set some priorities. We came up with a mission statement. I won't read that to you, but the whole goal here is to develop a plan. And these slides will be available after the session. So next slide, please. And here we establish high-level goals, as you can see, establishing a DEI a group, a foundation, looking for ways to promote equity in the employee experience. And of course, this obviously can be translated to the student experience. Provide learning opportunities and educational resources for coaches and student athletes, parents alike. Establishing best hiring practices for diversity guidelines, to Dr. Brooks's point in terms of hiring practices. So those are some high-level goals that we've established within our internal workings at the Federation. Next slide, please. So we decided to take the approach of, we took the acronyms of LEARN. So we are kind of, how do you say, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? So we decided that we wanted to take this approach where we would go through phases, and our first phase is the listening phase. And we use that phase, again, we've had the conversations around our feelings and thoughts around the George Floyd murder. We talked about our workplace experiences and how inequities are in play daily with our experiences. And now we're in the educational mode, which is really filled with a lot of workshops, new learning, and resources for our staff. So next slide, please. So when we set out a plan, now we are again in the work phase, and here's kind of a slide that will supplement the next several slides here. And this slide here really talks about kind of your format. At the Federation, we identified 6 opportunities to engage our staff, where we would use a format, a workshop format that's very terminology related, a glossary of terms, if you will. Workshops based on allyship. We just did one yesterday on allyship. Talking about privilege, explicit bias, implicit bias, stereotypes. So, think about kind of a structure in which you will deliver this information, this new learning to coaches and to students. We looked at, of course, these slides will be available, looking at TED Talks, having discussion sessions, establishing some agreements, which can definitely carry over to a team aspect, establishing some agreements about language that will be used, how teams will engage with one another. Also looking at resources, how to provide resources for either parents, coaches, teachers. Teachers and coaches, they're dealing with the same student. How do you establish resources for continued learning? So next slide. The next 4 or 5 slides, and I promise I'll get out of your way, the next 4 or 5 slides are really specific to the school space, the space that you all occupy. And so I have a few strategies here, just something for you to consider. The first strategy is making it a personal commitment to facilitate conversations. Know your demographics, understand the nature of the community that your school is in, the racial tensions, the issues that are there within your own community. I'll give you a quick example. Our community, the downtown Indianapolis area, there's a university, Indiana University, Purdue University, sits downtown. It has it's been there for about 51 years. But it was once, before that school went up, it was once an affluent Black community. They tore houses down to build that institution. That still lives on the community's Payne Triangle. So just today on the news, and I'm pleased to hear this, on the news, IUPUI is now offering scholarships to families that were displaced by building the IUPUI institution. So for those individuals who have lineage and who have family members that were displaced several years ago by the development of that building, will be able to receive scholarships. So that warmed my heart. The second bullet here, educate yourself. Do it on your own time. Be responsible for your own education around what's happening in terms of race relations. Next slide, please. The second strategy is to align your priorities as an athletic director. Know the strategy of the overall school district. Know what has, to Dr. Brooks's point, what has been identified as a core value or a goal. Know the school strategy within the school. Collaborate with key individuals in the school and seek alignment. Get a seat at the table. For anyone who is assembling a group of people, make sure you as an athletic director are a part of those conversations. Athletic department should be an arm of the overall strategy, school strategy. Next slide, please. Establish your role, and this is so important. You are responsible for setting up the experience in terms of conversations. You're not responsible for all of the content. You're not responsible to be a content expert. So I hope I have unburdened you with that bullet point. But educate teachers and coaches to help find ways to do that. Both are dealing, again, with the same student. Is the teaching consistent for teachers and students, making sure that it's seamless in terms of what's being taught or what's being communicated to teachers in terms of racial conversations are the same kinds of conversations and teachings that are happening at the coaching level. Teach around a glossary of terms. Again, terms like implicit bias, stereotypes, privilege. Build in preseason opportunities for parents on a voluntary standpoint. Host webinars. Parents need to really witness the humanity of athletic directors and showing that you have a level of empathy and desire to make sure their student athletes have a good experience. Students, of course, you can consider making it mandatory. Bring in team captains as conversators. Give them a little bit of training. Next slide, please. And perhaps this is one that's near and dear to my heart, which the work has been done in our office to really create a safe space. The fact of the matter is, none of these conversations will be effective if students do not feel safe. Establish an everybody is welcome type of locker room or program. Demonstrate empathy. Again, that word allyship to both of the doctor's points. Establish agreements with coaches and students. Agree to be approachable and listen as an athletic director. Agree to be accountable and responsible for anything that happens in your space with your athletic programs. Advocate for those who are underprivileged. Seek out real organic opportunities to discuss race and create teachable moments. Is that the end of my slide, or do I have one more? I think that's all I had to offer. I can't remember if that's all I had to offer. So that's all I have to offer. Those slides are available. Again, I took an organizational strategy approach to this, and so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mautrice. That was great. We certainly needed that too. Unfortunately, Dr. Keith Brooks has run into an emergency. He might not be able to join us. So we're going to have all three of you come on together now. Scott, Mautrice, and Renae, and we're going to get right into answering some questions and Q&A and having some dialogue. So we'll get right into that. Kevin, do we have one question already queued up?
Coach, can you stop sharing screen, please?
Specific question. Thank you once again to Dr. Brooks, Dr. Renae. Carlos, you took my screen away from me. Hold on. Thank you guys once again for presenting on our behalf. Our first question And unfortunately, Lanny had to leave, so she wants this recorded. But for our panelists, it says, in the COVID era, low-risk sports tend to be sports that are played by primarily white athletes, while high-risk sports are dominated by athletes of color. If only lower-risk sports can happen this year, is allowing that to happen a racist policy? And extending this concern, assuming the racial makeup of coaches is similar to that of the athletes, coaches of color will probably not be paid while white coaches will be. Can the panelists address this question and these concerns?
Mautrice, I was waiting on you.
I'm trying to read. I'm sorry. I'm reading through it myself too.
Okay. Well, so I'll tell you, I think that there's two questions in this. If we're talking about, is it a racist policy, right? For me, it's more important to talk about the implications. It's racist in its implications. So the fact that it has the consequences that we would see, where it effectively means that coaches of color are going to lose resources, they're not going to be paid, tells you that it has racist consequences, right? Calling it racist, I don't know that it matters whether or not we call it racist. It's a way of understanding, and this is the important part. We don't always understand the decisions that are being made and how it has what the impacts will be. This is a great indication of someone with insight that this is what's going to happen. If we don't have people who are able to think and understand this and identify it, these are the kind of things that happen again and again and become systemic. So it's a wonderful example of someone providing insight that others might not be thinking about. So should we allow it to happen? No, right? If our core value, and this is when I get back to anti-racism as a core value, understanding that this is what the impact will be means I can't say yes to that decision. We've got to figure something else out. And I don't know what the else is at the moment. We can kind of talk about, well, what would that look like? Maybe it is, are we going to split coaches' fees? Because we've got to figure out how we're going to cover all coaches, right? Part of that becomes one of the ways you think about it. How do we do this? And so that becomes the next phase. What do we do since this is not acceptable? We've got to figure out what else we can do. And, I think we can all respond, and then we can talk more about that if that's the direction we want to go.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would just offer that, in this COVID space that we are in, we are really about the safety of students, and understanding that there are high-risk sports that are played primarily by people of color. Not sure what we can really do about that reality. I know from a national organization and state associations, when they talk about which sports to move forward, they are talking from a space of safety first and risk minimization from a contracting standpoint, from a virus contraction standpoint. And so I think keeping that in mind, really the context of this question really should be in the spirit of keeping student athletes safe first, and then seeing if there are real opportunities to allow those high risk to move forward. I know that there are some seasons talking about shifting seasons. That may be an option. I'm not sure how to address the loss of pay with those coaches that coach high risk sports. So, but to really keep in mind safety first. And unfortunately, those high risk sports are the ones that maybe pushed down the road, and hopefully they'll still get a season.
Renae, do you have anything to add?
Excuse
I
me.
don't. When I'm in my element, I know where I'm in my element, and that's not one of them. So I will remain silent on that point.
That's great. Well, thank you guys for answering that. Good news.
Coach, this is Josh Scott. I don't want to step on anything too much, but I dropped in a Google Doc that I made a virtual expectation for COVID shutdown using a lot of coaching classes from the NFHS, some videos and student contact for social and mental health. And as our district, we were committed to paying our coaches if they followed through with that. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me and I can explain what I did. But I did a season 1 and a season 2 in case you were a men's and women's coach, like a football coach and a track coach, or both soccer coaches, different seasons. And it's a lot of team check-ins and things, but anyone is more than welcome to that document to look at and review. But that's how we were going to pay all of our coaches if we were shut down.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate that. We will certainly make sure that people see that. As I was saying, good news is that Dr. Brooks has been able to join us. So we would like to hear from him, and then we'll bring all 4 of our panelists back and continue our dialogue, answering as many questions as we can. But I would like to bring up Dr. Keith Brooks. And as he's coming on, I will share my screen for his presentation.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Brother Thomas, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, sounds good. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for your flexibility. I really appreciate it. There's a quote at the beginning of the portion that I have here, that I really like and resonate with. Just to reiterate, that these aren't really new issues in regards to the context of talking about racial equity. So it says there, George Floyd isn't a wake-up call. The same alarm has been ringing since 1619. Y'all just keep hitting snooze. I just really like that, just as a way of grounding. Can we go to the next slide, please? I love trivia, and I have a huge love for athletics and sports, and someone as a former athlete. Does anybody know the answer to this question?
Iowa State.
Iowa State. All right. And what is the name of the stadium?
Jack Trice Stadium.
Jack Trice Stadium. So I'm asking everybody, when you get an opportunity, and you see I put the links right there on the slide, yes, it's like many of these things that we're talking about can be heart-wrenching, but also motivating at the same time. And so when you all get an opportunity to glance at and look at the life of Jack Trice, I think it'll add great value. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I guess with that trivia question, the reason why I brought it up is that you would think with all the African-American athletes that are so very prominent throughout our history and currently, and thinking about the wide impact, you would think that there would be more. That's the point that I guess that I was getting at. So how has athletics advanced this dialogue? Just a few quick moments and snapshot in time. Anybody know who the person is on the left there in the football gear? I guess you could tell it's pretty early in the 20th century.
Paul Robeson.
Paul Robeson, yes, sir.
Rutgers University, 2-time All-American, was the only one that was not in the Hall of Fame as a 2-time All-American.
Break it down. Football player. When it came to getting his awards, couldn't even go into the country club to get his awards due to systemic racism. The valedictorian of his graduating class. Went on to be went to law school. I think it's at Columbia, but then because of systemic racism, couldn't practice law. But the brother could sing, and he's a wonderful speaker, wonderful actor, and a humanitarian. God knows if I become a millionaire, I'm gonna make a movie about his life if somebody hasn't done it already. So it was one of my childhood heroes, and I'm shocked that many people don't even know who Paul Robeson was. But again, like many of the things that we're talking about, it was purposeful and strategic to try to bury him and his legacy. When you think about the top right picture, think of the heavy hitters in this picture: Jim Brown, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell. And then you also see Althea Gibson, phenomenal tennis player. And then you see Tommy Smith and John Carlos of the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. Let's go to the next slide. I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just giving some brief things. I'm trying to parallel this picture with Carmelo, CP3, D Wade, and LeBron with the picture with Kareem and Muhammad Ali. I am not putting them on the same platform as them because it's a different era. But what I am trying to say is that I'm proud to see a lot of the athletes these days showing the intellectual side of who they are, which I know is there. And they've been a little bit more socially and racially conscious about the issues that are dealing with. I honor the fact that LeBron James has opened a school and that many of them are very active. When you think about Trayvon Martin being murdered in Florida a few years back, the demonstration that many athletes displayed. The next slide, please. So again, the kind of overall theme of my presentation is that I'm trying to say that there's nothing new under the sun. I'm trying to say that we find accurate and in-depth and substantive and meaningful solutions if we understand where we came from, if we understand the history. So what I'm trying to say here, what you'll notice perhaps maybe about all of them is that these are historically Black college and university graduates. Earl the Pearl, Shannon Sharp, Aaron McNair, Jerry Rice, Michael Strahan, Sweetness, Walter Payton. On the right, the top right, if you have not seen this film, you got to see it. It is phenomenal. Black Magic. And he's talking, Earl Monroe was a part of the producers and funders of this documentary, talking about the role of HBCUs and Black players going through there as they went into the NBA. Go to the next slide, please. So, you know, when you, and connecting the dots with the last slide, when you think about University of Alabama, Tennessee, Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, all the SEC in general, I guess I'm just blown away at all of the Black athletes, knowing that just about 50 years ago, they didn't want no parts of us. They didn't want us on their campuses at all. But when it comes to exploitation, when it comes to maximizing the Black body, we're always in the space. When we can do something to make money for individuals, then we're always called up. But in terms of connecting it with the current narratives, the University of Iowa, just keep a watch out. There's a major possibility that they might get sued by their former Black athletes for the time that they had there. I like when you get a chance, look up the shut up and dribble theme. I think a whole documentary was made when LeBron and Kevin Durant were speaking about social issues. You had a commentator say, shut up and dribble. I think it's irresponsible. I think it's one of the most racist things that a person can say is that, hey, on Sunday or this game, I want to show up and just see, I just want to be entertained. I don't want to hear their voice. And then you see Colin Kaepernick, who I do not think will ever get another job in the NFL. But on the left is Eric Reed. Eric Reed is just as much as a phenomenal football player who, because of his stance and his voice and him and Kaepernick going up against the NFL, he currently does not have a job. And I'm not certain he'll get another one as well. He was most recently offered a position to play on the practice squad for the Washington football team, the practice squad. But he's a perennial Pro Bowler. There's no way he could start for any team in the league right now. So also with the Washington football team, I'll look up the history of the numerous groups that try to remove the mascot for decades and then look at why now? Why 2020? Why this year? What was so unique about this year that they decided to take it down? And then the quote there comes from Bradley Beal. I'm just trying to communicate the mental models around individuals. I'm blaming him, but what I'm saying is many people of color feel that way in terms of their votes and their voice not counting. Next slide, please. I'm almost done. So you are seeing a change and a shift happening right now. There's conversations. I hope it happens. Because in many ways, Earl Campbell, the top left, and then Ricky Williams, you know, I mean, they are they are the pinnacle of the representation of University of Texas Austin football. So they're talking about naming the stadium Campbell Williams Stadium. That would be a huge deal. On the right, you see a top 5-star athlete, basketball player out of Arizona, I believe, who has committed to go to Howard University. And I hope, and he's also trying to recruit others. I hope that we see a resurgence of this, because part of the reasons why our predominantly white institutions have great endowments and wonderful resources is because of the Black athlete. And so in the 60s and 70s, when you started to see predominantly white institutions finally recruit Black athletes in large number, you see a direct decline of the resources at historically Black colleges, the places where the only place that would take us for us to further our education and our athletics. And yes, I am saying that I'm an unapologetic HBCU grad, Xavier University in New Orleans. So I recognize the patterns. And then I'm just glad to see many individuals, again, using their platform and their voice to address these issues. When you get a chance, the bottom right, look at LaVale Moton, North Carolina Central football coach. He called out predominantly white Power 5 coaches in terms of them not going radio silent after the killing of George Floyd and all the aftermath of that. He said, okay, coaches are quick to, do dances with Black players and show how cool they are. But when it comes to understanding their narrative, where are they at? And I thought that that was a legit case. Next slide, please. So very briefly, Monte Ellis is from Mississippi. Deion Sanders, y'all might have seen that he recently took over being the head football coach at Jackson State. I think it's a huge deal. I don't need to say much about that. Next slide, please. So again, takeaways, what should I do from here? One, unpack the history. I gave a brief snapshot. There's a lot more there. Understand numerous sides of an issue. I've seen throughout history many of our white counterparts partner with us and collaborate with us, and I'm just trying to say here that that's necessary, but it's important to understand the dynamics of the relationship and centering voices of color, and ensuring that our white brothers and sisters are not coming from a savior mentality when they think that they're helping. So I'm just saying, unpack the concept of help. And again, if they are engaged, again, on whose terms? Are folks doing what they want to do? Or are they doing things that are actually supportive and collaborative? And I'm just saying here that arrogance, defensiveness, and being easily offended, they are enemies of this work. And so I like to use an athletic term. Hey, am I coachable? For individuals that may not feel, hey, Keith, I don't feel like I can really navigate through this conversation competently. Okay, that's cool. But can I coach you? Can I check your thinking? Can I challenge your thinking? Last slide, please. I just love James Baldwin quote is that, time and time again, none of this stuff is new. We can have all these conversations all day, but sometimes it is a derailing tactic to have people going in circles to just keep having panels and conversations. And I think this is worthwhile. I'm honored to be on this. What I'm saying is, what are the action steps and the things that are going to be put into place? Thank you for allowing me to share. I'll go on mute.
Keith, come on back, because we're going to bring all 4 panelists together again, and we're going to continue the discussion. We have lots of questions. I also want to bring my good friend Ira Childress from Gulliver Prep on, who's going to help me co-host this. Ira, there you are, always dapper, looking good. So we're going to bring everybody together, and then I'm going to ask Kevin to give us any questions that we have gotten from the chat, and we'll continue our discussion.
Okay, while everybody's getting ready, once again, I did thank all the panelists prior. Dr. Brooks, thank you again as well. And we're always flexible when we have great individuals, just as the 4 of you, to help us get our message across. We have an additional question from Lasonda Wesson. It's a great question, just like the previous one. How can minority ADs who primarily serve in white spaces convince their parents and student athletes that racism is a real issue even if it does not personally affect them. Anyone from the panel, feel free to jump in.
Come on, Dr. Brooks, you got the doctor.
Dr. Payne, you do too, right? Well,
Yeah.
you know, I one of the things that I've learned as a professor is my job is to convey the information. I can't convert everybody. I can't make them see what they refuse to see. Gets back to what Dr. Brooks just said about coachable, right? And whether or not people are open. I think that, you know, the hope is when we're working with young people is they may not hear us and understand us now. Our job is to tell them the truth. But we hope that when their time comes and they are faced with it, that they will call upon that information that we have given them. And that to me has just been a realization as an educator. I can't force you, right? You can take a horse to the water, you can't make them drink it. What I try to appeal to more and more is, you know, and this is in the spirit of trying to collaborate. And I think that needs to be said up front as well, right? When someone has that spirit, my question is, so what are we doing here, right? If we have to have this conversation, what are we doing here? I could present you with all the facts. I've been in classes and presented quantitative data as well as qualitative data. If you refuse to take that in, then that tells me that your heart, your disposition is thinking about other things. This is something else. Whites, if you look at the research in psychology around white attitudes towards blacks and white anti-black racism, there is a spectrum. Nobody's a monolith. Blacks don't see this all the same way. Latinos, right? Asians, whites don't either. And there's a spectrum. And so increasingly what I'm looking at is, where are whites fitting on that spectrum? And that helps to inform me about how I should proceed. And the same thing for coaches and athletic directors. We've talked about this in terms of cultural competence, but we now have the research and have scales in which you could give this to your ADs, to your coaches, and see where they are. Those who have low levels of empathy, have high levels of fear, and moderate to low levels of guilt, it is very difficult for them to get to a point of thinking about being anti-racist, right? So those are the kind of three levels we see: fear, guilt, and empathy. Someone that has empathy, the higher the empathy, the more coachable they are. When we get to the guilt part, guilt is like yelling at someone. It can have short-term impact, but guilt often sways. When we look at the pendulum and are whites willing to move, are whites willing to be a part, see that guilt goes back and forth, right? So literally how whites responded right after George Floyd and right before Jacob Blake, there was already a pendulum switch back. I've worked with organizations where right after George Floyd, they wanted to speak with us. We get to right before Jacob Blake and they're saying anti-racism is a strong word. It actually puts me on my back foot. Jacob Blake gets shot 7 times and they come right back to the table. Hey, what can we do? So fear, guilt, empathy, those are measures. Those are things for whites to even take account of. We don't want a whole lot of black fear. A lot of black fear is resentment. It's threatening, right? You're taking my jobs. You're taking my opportunities. Empathy is the big one. And empathy, when we get back to people knowing their history, to understanding that even at the high school level, blacks are playing in these sports that bring great visibility to the schools. When we just look at doing the right thing, right? But if someone is not there, there's just not so much I can do. Even how they read what it is I present will be colored by their predispositions and their dispositions and their interpretations, such that they will have a reason why this wasn't racist. So there's only a limited amount I can do for that.
That's excellent. Yeah, I echo that. And I really like the empathy aspect. them basically asking, why should I care about this? And I would submit to you and to the parents and the students that it does impact them directly. And the case that I'm making is that, I'm in Minnesota. So we got Cargill, Best Buy, 3M, we got some major Fortune, US Bank, Wells Fargo. We got some major Fortune 500 companies. And what they're saying is that they're getting a lot of entry-level employees fresh out of college, fancy degrees from fancy universities, but their critical thinking is low. Their ability to problem solve is low. Their ability to communicate and interact with someone with that's different from them or have a different socialization from them is also deficient. So this is where Derek Bell talks about interest convergence, meaning these white institutions, they'll do things when they see that there's something in it for them. And I mean, I struggle with that. I really do. I understand that it's a realism, but I still struggle with it, right? Because folks should just do things, to do what's right. But many times these institutions don't move unless they get negative press or they get hit in the pocketbook. And so I try not to go there, but just to say, hey, our graduates are going to be global changers and global citizens, and they need to be able to interact with anybody. And so I wouldn't put a lot of time and energy to it. Maybe I'd have a few sessions, maybe some quarterly sessions with parents and students, but I wouldn't put the thrust of my time there. But I would definitely, again, unpack the history. And it's very simple. How many owners of color do we have of professional sports teams? How many CEOs and COOs do we have of color? We're trying to get them to see that although there's been lots of progress, there's still been lots of things that haven't changed since pre-1970. And I think it's important to do that. Of the 5 major areas, and I'll stop here. Education. So our graduation rates, where are people of color in terms of leadership beyond diversity positions, employment and career development, home ownership, real estate, law enforcement, policing, and health. Those are 5 areas that touch everybody. And if you can show them systemically how the disparities are so extreme, then they'll start to see things perhaps maybe a little bit differently. And I see somebody asked something about the white savior mentality, and I'll pause here unless folks want me to address that.
No, it did. Great, Dr. Keith. I was going to send that back to you as well, since you see that question, but I'll just read it since everybody sees it. You brought up savior mentality, and this term did come up during the recent Supreme Court nomination process, and some people aren't familiar with this. So can you elaborate?
Certainly, and it's not my aim to shut anybody down. It's not my aim to offend or harm anybody with my words. I'm harmless as a dove. I'm the kindest guy you ever want to meet. I have a cool sense of humor, I'd like to think, and I'm a cool cat to hang out with if I do say so myself. But when it comes to white savior mentality, what I'm going to ask you to do is just do a simple Google search of white savior films. Start there. White savior films. And what you'll see as a pattern is a bunch of this Blind Side, Dangerous Mind, all of these types of things that say people of color and Black people in particular cannot advance or progress without the aid of white people. That's the basic concept, is that they are freedom riders. Right? They can't help themselves. And the only way that they can progress or navigate through life is if I help them. Okay. If they do it my way, and or if they assimilate into whiteness or white norms of ways of communicating, existing, and in terms of belief system. And so it's a very, it might be a graduate level course. So, if this is your first time hearing that phrase, just start with the white savior films. And so let me start with one of the pushback comments that my college students used to give me. Well, The Blind Side was true, wasn't it? It was based on a true story. Yes. I'm not bashing or saying that the white family that helped Michael Orr, I'm not saying that something was wrong with that. But if you do some accurate and in-depth research, Michael Orr even pushes back on the image of him being viewed as some derelict ogre Shrek, lacking intellectual capacity, and this white family helped him be a better person. That is not the accuracy of the narrative. So it had a little Hollywood twist on it. So what I'm saying is these films and the mentality is subject to critique like anything else. So again, there's nothing wrong with their support, but the question is, what does that support look like?
If I can expand on that a little bit, and it's really just to double down on some of what Dr. Brooks said. It's not that people are not well-meaning. It's not that someone, we don't need help. We've talked about needing accomplice, co-conspirators, and allies. That's because of the structure, not because of our lack of ability, our lack of intelligence, our lack of work. And so the problem is when that a white person has an ally, and this is seen, right? You needed that person. It is as though we don't do the work ourselves, and that without them, we are not able to stand on our own. And so it's a lack of acknowledgement of the structure, right? So we have gotten to our positions in spite of all of the structural racism that we have encountered. It wasn't because of a white person that if everything equal and everything were fair, it wasn't that we needed help and a handout. We need it because the structure has to be navigated a particular way. And so what we're used to is not given the credit. And this is the whole problem with being called natural athletes. What that does is it obscures the amount of hard work, effort, mental navigation, even mental toughness that is required for us to succeed and to excel. And so the savior then comes in and gets all of this credit when the savior wasn't the one who did all the work and had to deal with all the microaggressions and everything else, right? So that's a part of it. And then when you look at the particular case of that family, what we know is that there's an exceptionalism that happens. And so it wasn't as though it changed for that family and they did it for all Black folks and they created systemic change. They helped one person. And so being Blacks, and we're often considered exceptions when we have achieved, we look at that and we know in our own communities that there are people who are just like us, who are just as capable, but weren't able to navigate it, didn't get the allied co-conspirators, and they're considered deemed pathologically inferior, and they meet the regular stereotypes that Blacks are not there. The pipeline issue, you don't have enough qualified. You haven't done all the things. That's not our fault. That's not our issue. And so the savior's mentality is thinking, right, and taking away the structural things that are impeding us, and instead giving agency to one individual who is needed and necessary, but it takes away all of the work that we've done individually, and it does not acknowledge the structural racism and systemic racism that is going on.
Any additional comments from any of the other panelists? If you like, there's a long comment in the chat. It wasn't phrased in a question format, but it was addressing some state decisions on addressing the pandemic and athletic situations. And I guess, quote unquote, passing the buck down to the school systems to make the decision on their participation, and a lot of them having to do this with a lack of the necessary resources. So it may be disproportionately affecting schools of minority athletes and coaches as well. So I don't know if anyone wants to address that. It wasn't a question, it was more of an observation in that way. And I'd just like to add to what Dr. Brooks said. With that savior mentality, there was a term used prior to that, back in the day, it used to be called white man's burden. And it's burdensome of the white population to have to do this for the minority population. And it goes hand in hand with that savior mentality. So as Dr. Keith said, look that up as well. Google it and see what that entails in and of itself. And that's historical. But Anthony, there isn't another question in there at this time. I know you did refer to Ira. Ira may have something great to share for all of us. So Brother Childress, please speak up.
Yeah, I don't know if I have any great to say. These panelists have been outstanding. I think that's great. The one question or one thing I did want to pose to the panelists, because I've lived it in my experience myself, is I'm at one of the top independent schools in the country. I was the first African-American athletic director here at Gulliver Prep here in Miami, Florida. At my last previous school, I was the first African-American athletic director there. Down here in South Florida, I'm the only athletic director at a private school, and Black athletic director at a private school down here, independent school. So the question is how do we get more people, and Dr. Renae Myles Payne and I talk about this all the time, but how do we get more people in these seats? I mean, because on this panel, we have a lot of esteemed African-American athletic directors, but when you look beyond this panel, there's not a lot of them, and not a lot of them outside of the roles that are in inner cities, which I think is very important. I grew up, in the poorest county in the state of Michigan, and so I get that in public housing and all that, and we needed people in our community to look up to as well. But also, I think we need people of color in other jobs as well. And I feel like we're funneled into, if it's not an inner city job or if it's not a quote unquote Black school, we're not getting those opportunities. You can go from Miami, West Palm Beach, all the way up the coast. There's no other Ira Childresses in these roles. So that's a problem, So the question is, how do we change that? And how do we get other people of color in these seats?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dr. Ira. I like to start with the why. Like to you and I, and maybe many other folks on the call here, it might be evident to us in my travels. I'm not convinced that it's important to many of these institutions. As was alluded to earlier, many of our white brothers and sisters think that when we progress or when we get certain leadership positions or certain influential or decision-making positions, that somehow we've taken a white person's seat. So we have to address that mental model. If we think long-term, when I think about the why, I'm very adamant about ensuring that we maximize our human resources. And so it's so amazing to me. Here's another great documentary, the University of Miami. It wasn't even a hard thing or a second guess for Jimmy Johnson to go up in the hood and get them Black males. That wasn't that hard. He's like, let me go where the best athletes are. Let me go to where the diamonds are. And he went in there and recruited, Michael Irvin and all those great players that made Coral Gables University of Miami a stellar institution with a multi-million-dollar endowments. So my point is that how do we go to where people are? What I understood once I started doing my research in my 20s and 30s is the concept of social capital and social network. What I found of wealthy folks, or even some of my white brothers and sisters that I have relationships with, their kids had a lot of exposure in traveling overseas or traveling across the country, or hey, parents were attorneys or work at a medical facility. They were at different places. So my thing is, how are we intentional with our young people about expanding their worldview and expanding what they are exposed to? So that's where I like to start. I think it's criminal. And let me be clear, I think it's criminal for coaches like Roy Williams and others at these major institutions where they're graduating Black males with general studies degrees. Let me be very direct and clear about that. Meaning, in terms of long-term, how are we positioning our athletes, our student athletes, to be in positions of success when it comes to internships and other opportunities? So, and part of it is on many of our communities of color as well, where, you know, I've gone to high schools in the hood. I'm from South Central LA, Compton and Inglewood and North Long Beach. I get bothered when Black folks show up for a championship game, but I can't find these folks interacting with the principals and the teachers and at the school boards. So what I'm saying is, and I'm not judging, you know, what I'm saying is we have to be consistent about how we are supporting our own in that concept in terms of geographically, but also how are our institutions creating an intentional pipeline and pathway to see more of you.
Thank you. Other panelists, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just going to share. I mean, there's a lot there. I appreciate that. There's a whole lot there. Two words that come to mind, or first word that comes to mind is pipeline. And we talk about pipelining in our office, even at the national level, in terms of appropriate representation on committees, where our rules committees, we're not able to fulfill kind of this requirement that what we call are now a soft requirement that we have proper representation. We can't have a national track and field rules committee where there are no minorities represented. That makes no sense. And so we talk about pipelining. We have some state associations that, you know, in some regions, you know, where there's not a healthy population of African Americans or minorities. And so we're at a loss. And no, that's not an excuse. So at the at the federation level, we are having those real hard conversations about how do you build a true pipeline, and how do you insist that these folks are at the table and represented. How do you do that? So we are in discussions about that now, but it actually takes someone like all of us on this panel in leadership positions to push it, because our counterparts, our white counterparts, are in a lot of cases not going to. They're not passionate about it. They're not as tethered to it as we are. Again, to the work that Dr. Scott Brooks talked about in terms of doing the work and then obviously looking for a sponsor to say, hey, I've helped you along the way. No, we need to be elevated on our own merit based on the hard work that we've done. But it also has to be systemic. It has to be structural. It has to be systemic. So everybody has to do their part. To your point, you can't go into a high school and just show up at the championship game and you've not engaged with that school all year long or all season long. You have to be a player more than just coming to the game. You have to be a player in the structure of the school. And so you have to be a part. You have to participate. You can't just show up.
You know, I one of the things that, you know, I struggle with, and part of it is coaching at the grassroots level, is the I feel like the point about pipelines, particularly when I hear it from whites in positions of power, it doesn't work for me. The reason is when you coach at grassroots, right? I did my dissertation research coaching basketball in South Philadelphia, in a basketball league where in the inner city, we are told that Black men are not around, right? That they have left their families, they're not doing anything constructive. And instead, night after night, day after day, 5 days a week in the gym for practice, 2 days, you know, of games. This league has been going on since 1968 in all the different parts of Philadelphia, the 6th largest city in our country. And I know if I go to LA, I go back to my hometown in Oakland, I'm going to find young Black men and women and older Black men and women at our parks and rec, out at any kind of field, any kind of, playground, out there doing the work. And so that tells me that we don't have a pipeline issue. We have an issue of how are we recognizing and acknowledging the work that these coaches are doing, often as volunteers after a long day's work somewhere else. When you look at what happened in the investment banking world, they were only bringing in Harvard MBAs. Then they realized this wasn't getting them maximum profit. There were folks who were coming from other MBA programs who seemed to be better and were open to thinking and being more creative. Stanford had more creative thinkers. And they started to say, you know what, we're not just going after Harvard MBAs anymore. We've got to look at some of these other programs. When you look in the medical field, they only wanted MDs. They wanted people who graduated from these particular programs. And then they realized they had poor bedside manner. So what do they start saying? You know, we don't want you to all come from bio backgrounds. We need you to come from some other majors where maybe you'll learn how to speak to people, because just knowing the science and the math doesn't lead to great health care. So we're at that same place. What does it take to be a great coach? What does it take to be a great athletic director? What does it take to be a great principal? Are they the same things? And are the criteria that we are using, if this criteria has gotten us to this point, then we need to change the criteria. When we're now looking at bringing in more mental health counselors, I'm hearing of the schools and universities that are saying, maybe we don't need you to have a master's in counseling if you've already done the work. You've put in years of this. You have the experience. We have gotten so bureaucratic in these ideas of what the criteria are, and they haven't worked. They haven't gotten us to where we want to be. So we need to open up and take a look at our hiring practices. How are we, when you look at a good coach, what does that actually mean? What are those skill sets? And when you do that, you can now change how you're bringing in people, because when you look at top down, and it's the same thing. I love the question that Lonnie gave us. When there is a crackdown on AAU, and you're looking at basketball at the grassroots for boys and girls, the people who are mostly affected and impacted were Black coaches in their communities who had to adjust to the AAU circuit and found ways to be successful. And yes, they were getting paid by these sneaker companies. When you cut that out, and the corruption that was happening at the college level was not them. They weren't breaking rules. College coaches were breaking rules. Rick Pitino was breaking rules. But I go back to Philadelphia and I see these grassroots coaches who invested all this time and they've been cut out. Rick Pitino has a job again. And he's been making millions of dollars for 15 years at least. And you get the grassroots coaches who can coach in our schools, who could become athletic directors because they know the communities, all the things that Mautrice talked about. They know the communities. They know the history of the communities. They know the families. They can go back and talk to the families about your kid maybe needs to get it together in the classroom. We are not using our grassroots. We're not utilizing these coaches who invest all of this time. And for those high impact sports, we have cut out the women and men of color who have invested all this time in communities. They don't have another piece rung on the ladder to go up. And we look at our schools, private schools and so on, that use these coaches to get to the athletes that they've invested in, and they're not the ones reaping the benefits and the rewards there. So I think we really have to look at that. And if you're really about it, this gets back to that why. You can become creative in thinking, what are our hiring practices and how can we get to these coaches that are invested in these communities and invest in these young people?
Oh, wow. Dr. Brooks, thank you. I want to be mindful of time. Y'all gonna make me do a part 3 of this. I knew that was probably gonna happen. So we might have to talk about that because you touched on so many different things. And I just want to add, as one of the co-founders of NOMAD, this is what NOMAD was created for. We have to create these pathways. I just got off the phone with the head of a school of a pretty prominent school in my area, advocating for one of our NOMAD members to get that job. We have to advocate for each other and work to support each other. And when we find these jobs, as Ira has mentioned, we need to be promoting from within and pushing our people to get those opportunities. And so that's something that NOMAD, we're going to continue to work on. I hope everyone is just proud of this organization and what we've been able to accomplish in 4 months and what we're going to continue to accomplish. I want to thank our panelists today. for coming on and speaking. It means so much, especially Dr. Brooks, Scott Brooks, and Dr. Renae. They're on our advisory board. We're so appreciative of your support and everything that you do, as well as Mautrice. And then Keith, we just met today and you came on, you were dealing with emergency. I don't know how you dropping knowledge, driving a car and talking to us and doing everything that you do, especially in Minnesota, because I know your weather ain't that great because I've been out there and tried to drive on those streets. I'm so appreciative of all of you, and I know our members are, and we just want to thank you. And I'm just going to share my screen quickly to just share some resources that we want to share with the folks, and get to it. So here's just some resources. You know, uncomfortable conversations with a Black man. You know, there's Race Talk and Conspiracy of Silence. That's our current book study at NOMAD that we've been reading. It really does help to facilitate some dialogues. We're using it here at my school. Courageous Conversations About Race by Glenn Singleton. And there's some other links that you guys will all have access to. The other thing, I want to remind you of our upcoming webinar. Save the date, November 18th, 12:30 Eastern Time. Life of Duality, Women of Color and Athletic Administrations, Our Stories, Our Truths. That's going to be a powerful one. We got a dynamic panel for that as well. So make sure that you save that date. Email us with any topics or things that you want to cover. We're certainly here to support you. Lastly, just again, thank you for attending today's webinar. Check out our website for additional resources. Contact us for information on mentoring. That's another peer that we want to have. Good night, everybody. We'll see you later. Thank you.